What advice did von Neumann give Richard Feynman that changed everything forever? There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a person the first time they realize someone else's mind works on a completely different level than their own. Not just faster, not just more trained or more practiced, but structurally different in some way that is difficult to articulate and even harder to accept. It is the silence of a young scientist standing at the edge of a room filled with some of the most formidable thinkers of the 20th century, looking inward at their own thoughts and wondering, for the first time with genuine seriousness, whether those thoughts are enough. Richard Feynman was never short on confidence. Anyone who knew him even briefly could tell you that. He had a kind of restless, almost defiant energy that seemed to treat every problem as a personal challenge, every unanswered question as an affront to his curiosity. He came from a background that was not steeped in old-world academic tradition, and that outsider quality gave him a certain freedom. He did not approach physics with reverence. He approached it with something closer to appetite. But even appetite has its limits when you find yourself sitting in the same room as someone who processes the world in ways you have never encountered before. That kind of encounter changes a person, not because it humiliates them or because it reveals them to be somehow lesser than they imagined, but because it forces a re-examination of what intelligence actually is, what it is for, and who gets to decide when someone has enough of it. The story of Feynman's intellectual development is, in many ways, the story of a mind learning to understand itself, not in isolation, but in relation to others. And one of the most quietly transformative of those relationships was the one he developed with John von Neumann. To understand why that relationship mattered so much, you have to understand something about the world Feynman was entering as a young physicist in the early 1940s. The institutions he moved through were not simply places of learning. They were ecosystems of reputation, where the hierarchy of intellectual standing was felt at every level, where a junior researcher understood without being told exactly where they sat relative to the luminaries in the room. There was an unspoken grammar to those spaces, a language of deference and positioning that was entirely separate from the actual work of doing science. For someone like Feynman, who had little patience for social performance and almost no instinct for self-promotion in the traditional academic sense, this could be deeply disorienting. He was talented, genuinely and obviously talented, and he knew it at some level. But talent in the abstract is very different from talent that has been tested against the best minds of a generation. Until that testing happens, a young scientist is working with an incomplete picture of themselves, and the incompleteness has a way of producing anxiety that no amount of raw ability can entirely dissolve. The anxiety was not about failure in any simple sense. Feynman was not worried about being embarrassed in a seminar or about getting a problem wrong in front of colleagues. It ran deeper than that. It was the anxiety of not knowing where the ceiling was, of wondering whether the confidence he felt was real or simply the confidence of someone who had not yet been truly challenged. There is a particular kind of self-doubt that does not come from weakness. It comes from intelligence, from the ability to imagine all the ways in which your current understanding might be inadequate. Feynman had that kind of intelligence, and it shadowed him. Then he encountered John von Neumann, and the shadow shifted. Von Neumann was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary mathematical minds in recorded history. The scope of his contributions spans areas that most specialists spend entire careers exploring only partially. The foundations of quantum mechanics, the mathematical architecture of game theory, the logical structure of early computing, the deep questions of set theory and functional analysis. These were not casual contributions. They were foundational, the kind of work that other researchers build entire careers around, the kind of insights that restructure a field rather than merely advancing it. What made von Neumann remarkable to those who encountered him in person, though, was not just the volume or depth of his output. It was the texture of how he thought. People who worked alongside him described something that was genuinely difficult to put into words: a kind of simultaneity in his reasoning, as though he were tracking multiple lines of argument at once, without any of them suffering for the division of attention. Problems that other mathematicians would need hours or days to work through would resolve themselves for him in the course of a casual conversation. Not because he was cutting corners, but because the corners did not exist for him. He had a structural grasp of certain kinds of mathematical thinking that simply bypassed the intermediate steps that everyone else had to climb. For a young physicist with Feynman's gifts, encountering this was a clarifying experience in ways that were not entirely comfortable. Feynman's own intelligence operated differently. Where von Neumann was architecturally brilliant, able to hold the scaffolding of complex systems in mind with apparent ease, Feynman was more intuitive, more physical in his thinking, more inclined to feel his way through a problem by imagining it concretely before formalizing it abstractly. These were not the same kind of intelligence. They were not even competing for the same territory in any simple way. But in the early years of their acquaintance, before Feynman had fully understood this, the difference felt more like a deficit than a distinction. There is a particular form of intellectual generosity that the most genuinely capable people sometimes possess, and von Neumann had it. He was not interested in performing his own superiority. He was not, in the way of certain brilliant people, seeking confirmation of his own greatness from the reactions of those around him. What he was interested in was thinking, and he was genuinely curious about how other people thought, even people who thought more slowly or differently than he did. This curiosity was not condescending. It was real. It was in that spirit that a conversation took place, not a formal exchange, not a structured mentoring session, but the kind of quiet, sideways conversation that happens when two people are thinking alongside each other rather than at each other. The context was the kind of pressure that wartime science generates, the sense that the work being done was consequential in ways that extended far beyond the usual scope of academic achievement. That context had a way of stripping away the protective irony that scientists often use around their own work, of making things feel suddenly, uncomfortably personal. What Feynman was carrying into that conversation was something that many brilliant people carry and few acknowledge openly, a profound sense of responsibility that had curdled over time into something close to guilt. The guilt of a person who believes, at some deep level, that the consequences of their work are somehow proportional to their ability to understand it. That if you are smart enough to contribute to something powerful, you are also somehow responsible for everything that power eventually does. It is an irrational burden in many ways, but it is not an uncommon one among people who take both their intelligence and their ethics seriously. Von Neumann's response to this, offered without fanfare and without the weight of deliberate counsel, was essentially a reframing. The conversation moved, as these things often do, from the immediate and specific to the general and philosophical, and somewhere in that movement, an idea emerged that Feynman would carry for the rest of his life. The idea had to do with the distinction between what a person is responsible for and what a person is merely capable of influencing. These are not the same thing. Intelligence does not confer unlimited responsibility. The ability to understand a system does not mean that you control it, or that the consequences of its operation belong to you personally. Choosing where to place your sense of responsibility, treating it as something to be directed thoughtfully rather than felt globally and indiscriminately, is not an abdication of conscience. It is, in fact, the only way to act with genuine integrity rather than paralyzing oneself with a guilt that serves no one. This is not a revolutionary idea in itself. Philosophers and ethicists have circled it from many directions. But there is a difference between encountering an idea in abstract form and having it arrive in your life at exactly the moment when your mind is most prepared to receive it, offered by someone whose own relationship with consequence and responsibility was as complex as anyone's alive at that time. Von Neumann was not speaking theoretically. He He was speaking from a life spent at the intersection of pure intellectual achievement and world-altering practical application. His words carried a weight that came from that specific gravity. What shifted for Feynman in the aftermath of that conversation was not his ambition or his commitment to science. Those remained exactly what they had always been. What shifted was the internal architecture of his confidence. Before, his confidence had been, in part, a performance of security over an underlying anxiety. Afterward, it began to evolve into something more genuinely settled, a relationship with his own intelligence that was curious rather than defensive, engaged rather than armored. This shift had practical consequences. It changed how Feynman approached problems, not just intellectually, but emotionally. He became less interested in whether he was the smartest person working on a given question, and more interested in whether he was understanding it as deeply as he could. The comparison to others, which had never entirely disappeared, but which had sometimes been a source of static in his thinking, became less central. His intelligence, he came to understand, was not valuable primarily as a measure of his position relative to others. It was valuable as a tool for doing work that mattered. The relationship between the two men deepened over time into something genuinely mutual, which was itself an education in how different kinds of intelligence can coexist and enrich each other without requiring one to dominate the other. Von Neumann was faster, broader, more architecturally powerful in his mathematical thinking. That was simply true, and no amount of generous framing changes the basic fact. But Feynman had something that von Neumann admired and drew upon: a capacity for physical intuition, for finding the conceptual heart of a problem before the formal apparatus was in place, for imagining the world concretely enough to ask questions that purely abstract thinkers sometimes overlooked. This mutual recognition, the experience of two minds finding genuine value in each other despite obvious differences in raw computational power, was its own kind of lesson. It was a living demonstration of something that is easy to say and difficult to fully believe: that intelligence is not a single thing, measured on a single scale, where the only meaningful question is how high a particular individual lands. It is a collection of distinct capacities, each of which matters in different contexts, each of which can contribute to a shared project in ways that are genuinely complementary rather than merely compensatory. The myth of genius, the popular idea that the truly extraordinary mind operates as a kind of singular self-contained phenomenon, elevated above the ordinary processes of human thinking and human limitation, was something that both men, in different ways and at different speeds, came to see as a distortion. Von Neumann was extraordinary in ways that are almost impossible to overstate, but he was also a person, embedded in relationships, subject to the ordinary pressures of ego and ambition and self-doubt, capable of being wrong, capable of being influenced by others in ways he could not fully account for. Feynman, who spent much of his career vigorously resisting the mythologization that was already beginning to gather around him during his lifetime, understood this as clearly as anyone. The resistance to mythologization was not false modesty. It was, in a sense, an extension of the same intellectual honesty that made him a great scientist. You cannot understand a system that you are not willing to look at accurately. And a person who allows themselves to become a myth, who accepts or encourages the story that their achievements are the product of some kind of magical, unteachable, unrepeatable faculty rather than of specific habits of thought and specific kinds of engagement with the world, is not just indulging in vanity. They are actively making it harder for other people to learn from them. The genius narrative, in other words, is not just wrong. It is harmful. What both Feynman and von Neumann demonstrated, each in his own way, was that the most significant intellectual achievements tend to involve enormous amounts of what might be called intellectual courage, the willingness to sit with confusion longer than feels comfortable, to refuse easy answers, to hold the uncertainty of not knowing open long enough for something genuinely new to emerge from it. This is not a supernatural capacity. It is a habit, a demanding habit, one that requires real emotional fortitude and real tolerance for discomfort, but a habit nonetheless. And habits can be learned, cultivated, practiced, passed on. There came a time, as there comes for all people regardless of their gifts, when the conversation about intelligence began to include the conversation about time. Von Neumann was not old by the standards of ordinary life when his health began to change. But the arc of a scientific career is sometimes measured in different units than the arc of a life, and the most productive years of his formal theoretical work had largely been completed by the time the physical difficulties arrived. What remained was a kind of retrospective clarity, a view of the whole structure of a career from a vantage point that is only available once the building has largely been completed. What that vantage point revealed, at least as it filtered through to those who knew him, was something that felt at odds with the popular narrative of genius as a form of invulnerability. The extraordinary mind, it turns out, has the same relationship with impermanence as every other mind. The work persists, or some of it does. The reputation takes on a life of its own. But the person, the actual thinking, feeling, wondering human being who generated that work, is as mortal as anyone else, as subject to loss and diminishment and the accumulation of ordinary sorrow. There was nothing tragic about this, or there did not need to be. It was simply the condition of being alive and capable of reflection. For Feynman, observing this gradual and quiet human reality in someone he had come to respect as deeply as anyone he knew was its own kind of education. Not in the dramatic, sudden way that revelations sometimes arrive, but in the slow, steady way that certain kinds of understanding accumulate. He was watching intelligence itself grow more honest about its limits, watching a person who had spent a lifetime achieving things that seemed to transcend ordinary human capacity come to a place of simple, unguarded humanity, and finding that the simplicity and the transcendence were not opposites after all. The things that stay with a person in the end are rarely the things that confirm their own superiority. They are the things that showed them something true. The moments when the pretense fell away, when the performance of confidence or capability gave place to something quieter and more genuine. The conversations that did not resolve into easy conclusions, but instead opened something up, left a question richer than it had been before it was asked. The relationships that required you to revise your picture of what intelligence was, what it was for, what it owed to the world. Understanding, it turns out, is more durable than recognition. A person can achieve enormous recognition and never quite get to understanding, never quite arrive at the place where they know what their work actually means, why it matters, what it connects to beyond the narrow scope of professional achievement. And a person can achieve deep understanding with very little recognition, can spend a life genuinely grasping things that most people never access, without ever being celebrated for it in the ways that the culture celebrates visible success. These two things, understanding and recognition, travel together often enough to create the illusion that they are the same thing. They are not. What Feynman took from his long acquaintance with von Neumann was not primarily a set of techniques or insights, though those were present too. It was something more fundamental, a revised relationship with the question of what his own intelligence was for. Not for domination, not for the proof of superiority, not even for the accumulation of achievements that could be listed and evaluated and compared. It was for understanding, for contributing to the project of human knowledge in the specific ways that his specific kind of intelligence made possible, for doing the work that needed doing with the tools he actually had, rather than the tools he sometimes wished he had. Curiosity, in this framework, becomes not just a pleasant personality trait or a useful driver of research. It becomes something closer to an ethical commitment. The choice to keep looking, to keep asking, to treat the world as genuinely mysterious and therefore genuinely worth attending to, is the choice to remain in honest relationship with reality rather than retreating into the comfort of what you already know. That choice does not guarantee success in any worldly sense. It does not protect you from being wrong, from wasted effort, from the particular frustration of following a line of inquiry that leads nowhere you can use. But it keeps you honest. It keeps the thinking alive. The advice that arrived in that quiet conversation was not a secret formula or a private insight unavailable to anyone else. It was the kind of wisdom that circulates in some form in every tradition that has thought seriously about how to live a thoughtful life. Choose your responsibilities deliberately. Know the difference between what you can genuinely affect and what you are only suffering over from a distance. Be kind to your own intelligence rather than using it as a weapon against yourself. Simple enough to say. Genuinely difficult to live. What made it land was the combination of the moment, the messenger, and the person receiving it. Feynman was at exactly the point in his development where those ideas could take root, where he was intellectually mature enough to grasp their implications, but still open enough to let them change him. Von Neumann was, by then, someone whose relationship with his own extraordinary capacity had been tested by enough of the world's complexity to speak about limits and responsibility from genuine experience rather than theoretical reflection. And the moment itself, the particular pressure of work that felt consequential in the largest possible sense, stripped away the usual defenses and made genuine listening possible. That combination is rare. Most good advice dissolves without effect because the conditions are not right. This particular exchange happened to catch something at exactly the right angle, and the light it produced illuminated a path that Feynman followed, in his own idiosyncratic and irreplaceable way, for the rest of his life. There is something in this story that belongs to everyone who has ever stood at the edge of a room filled with brilliant people and felt the particular cold of their own uncertainty. The feeling is not a sign of inadequacy. It is a sign that you are paying attention, that you are taking seriously the distance between where you are and where your thinking might eventually take you, if you stay curious, if you stay honest, if you choose deliberately and repeatedly to care about understanding over appearing to understand. The room is always full of minds that work differently than yours. Some will be faster, some will be broader, some will see connections that you will miss entirely. None of that changes what you have to offer. None of it changes the specific, unrepeatable texture of your own engagement with the world's questions. The best use of an extraordinary intellect, whether it is von Neumann's or Feynman's or anyone else's, is not to measure itself against others and find them wanting. It is to look outward, at the genuine strangeness and difficulty of what is not yet understood, and to bring whatever it has, however much or little that is, to the project of understanding it. That is what science is for, in the end. That is what thinking is for. Not to establish a hierarchy of minds, but to extend, collectively and imperfectly and with enormous patience, the boundary of what human beings know about the world they inhabit. Every mind that joins that project, honestly, without pretense, without the need to win, adds something that would not otherwise be there. And the world, quietly and without fanfare, is larger for it.